Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I should have known better. The moment I turned down that old logging road, something in me whispered to turn back. But after weeks of driving aimlessly, I was desperate for an adventure, something to break the monotony of drifting through the back roads in my RV. The Bitterroot National Forest had always been on my list of places to document, and when I heard about a forgotten logging trail deep in the woods, I felt that old spark return. I needed it. I needed to feel like I could still find something that mattered, something untouched by the world. The road was rougher than I expected. My RV rocked and creaked as I maneuvered over deep ruts and broken asphalt, but I pressed on, stubbornly clinging to the hope that this forgotten path held the key to snapping me out of the daze I'd been in since the injury. The accident had taken everything from me: my career, my sense of purpose, my place in the world. The camera gear in the back was all I had left, but lately, even that felt like a mockery of who I used to be. I parked the RV in a small clearing that seemed to open out of nowhere, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. The air was crisp and cool, and the mountains loomed in the distance, a jagged line of stone cutting into the sky. There wasn't a soul around, which was exactly how I wanted it. Solitude, space to think, and maybe, just maybe, I could find that old logging road, the one nobody talked about anymore, the one the locals had warned me to stay away from. The first day was uneventful enough. I hiked through the forest, snapping pictures of the landscape, trying to capture the eerie beauty of the place. There was something different about the air here, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just odd, like the forest was watching me. I brushed it off, focusing on my work. The photos were decent, but nothing extraordinary. I wanted more. Something about that old logging road kept nagging at me, like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. I'd read about it in an old hiking forum, just a passing mention of a trail used decades ago, abandoned after some tragic accident. The details were vague, but that's what intrigued me. There was a story here, waiting to be uncovered, something hidden. I spent most of the afternoon searching for the road, but by sundown I hadn't found anything that even resembled a trail. The forest felt more like a labyrinth, each tree blending into the next, making it impossible to get a sense of direction. I finally gave up, heading back to the RV as the sky darkened. That night, I had strange dreams. I was walking through the woods, following the sound of an old logging saw grinding against wood. But when I reached the source of the noise, there was nothing there, just shadows and something else. Voices, faint and echoing, as if coming from far away. When I woke up, I was sweating, my heart racing. The RV was cold, the morning light just starting to filter through the small windows. I shook off the lingering unease, chalking it up to too much time alone in the woods. I'd been out here for days now, and solitude had a way of messing with your head. I found the path later that afternoon. I didn't mean to. It just appeared, as if the forest had shifted overnight. I was walking along the ridge, hoping to catch the sunset, when I spotted it below me. A narrow, overgrown trail, half hidden by fallen branches and moss. It wound down into the valley, disappearing into the thick of the trees. My pulse quickened. This had to be it. I scrambled down the slope, barely able to contain the excitement buzzing in my chest. This was what I'd been looking for. The forgotten path. The reason I'd come all this way. The forest grew denser as I descended, the trees closing in around me, casting long shadows across the trail. It felt like the air was heavier here, like it was holding something in. The smell of damp earth filled my lungs as I carefully navigated the uneven ground, snapping pictures of the trail as I went. But something was off. The deeper I went, the more the trail seemed to shift. What had been a clear path moments before would suddenly narrow, twisting into an unrecognizable tangle of roots and rocks. Landmarks, a particular boulder, a dead tree, seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I found myself walking in circles, coming back to the same spot over and over again. I glanced at my GPS. The screen flickered and froze. Useless. What the hell? I muttered, smacking it against my palm. Nothing. I checked my watch next. Same problem. The hands were stuck, motionless. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. Something kept pulling me forward, deeper into the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something important, something just out of reach. That's when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the longer I stood there, listening, the clearer they became. Low, muffled voices, like people talking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there. Whispers echoing through the trees. I called out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. No one answered. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was already setting, casting the forest in an eerie twilight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like the trees themselves were keeping tabs on me. The path had shifted again on my way back, making the journey longer than it should have been. I was exhausted, but the thrill of finding the forgotten trail kept me awake. I spent that night tossing and turning, my mind replaying the strange events of the day. The voices, the shifting trail, the way time seemed to stretch and warp. I told myself it was just the isolation, just my brain playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV surrounded by fog. Thick, impenetrable mist clung to the trees, swallowing the world outside. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I grabbed my camera and stepped out, determined to explore the trail again. Maybe today I could capture something that made sense of all this. The path was different this time. It wasn't just overgrown, it was decaying. The ground was littered with rusted equipment, old saws and axe heads half buried in the dirt. I snapped pictures as I walked, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voices were louder now, more insistent. And the forest. God, the forest felt alive, like it was watching my every move. I found the clearing by accident. It opened up suddenly, the trees parting to reveal an old logging camp. The cabins were crumbling, the wood rotting away under years of neglect. Rusted chains and gears were scattered around, remnants of a time long forgotten. And then I saw them. Figures moving in and out of the mist. Loggers bent over their work, their movements mechanical, repetitive. They didn't seem to notice me at first, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats, their axes swinging in perfect unison. I should have run. I should have turned back. But I didn't. I watched as one of the figures paused, lifting its head. Slowly, it turned toward me, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a blank, featureless expanse of pale skin. It moved toward me, silent, deliberate. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but when I stumbled back to the RV, gasping for air, I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever I had found, it wasn't meant to be seen. The forest had let me in, but it wasn't going to let me leave. Not easily. I packed up in a frenzy, my hands shaking as I shoved my gear into the RV. The fog was lifting now, revealing the twisted shapes of the trees around me. The voices had followed me back, a constant whispering hum just outside my hearing. I started the engine and tore down the logging road, not caring about the potholes or the damage to the RV. I just needed to get out. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. And then the fog closed in again. I made it out of the forest, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. The pictures I took, half of them don't make sense. Blurred figures, shifting trees, the clearing. empty where the loggers had been. I destroyed the camera. I don't want to remember what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the voices, whispering, calling me back. The desert was supposed to be quiet. A silence so deep it would drown out the noise in my head. That's why I came to Joshua Tree, why I parked my RV at the edge of the park, far from the tourists and hikers. I needed silence. After everything that had happened with my father, the hospital, the funeral, the endless apologies, I couldn't take the sound of it all anymore. I thought the desert would give me peace. I was wrong. The sun had just dipped behind the rocky outcroppings, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was warm, dry, and still. Not a single breeze rustled the twisted branches of the Joshua trees that surrounded my camp. I sat on a folding chair, facing the expanse of the desert, my recording equipment set up beside me. This was supposed to be a personal project, capturing the ambient sounds of the desert at night. The sound of nothing. That was what I needed. But as the stars appeared and the sky turned from orange to deep blue, I realized something was off. It wasn't quiet. I heard it at first as a low hum, barely audible, like the distant vibration of machinery. I turned my head, thinking maybe it was coming from the road, but I was miles from anyone or anything. There was no wind, no cars, no people. And yet, the sound was there, deep, rhythmic, like a pulse coming from beneath the earth. I frowned, adjusting the sensitivity on my microphones. The levels jumped, confirming that the sound wasn't in my head. It was real, a steady rumble beneath the desert floor. I hit record, curious more than anything. Maybe it was some natural phenomenon. Earth settling, rocks shifting, something geological. I tried to focus on the desert around me, the vast emptiness that had brought me here, but my mind kept returning to that sound. By midnight, the rumbling had stopped, leaving only the silence I'd been craving. I played back the recording, leaning in to hear the faint echoes. The desert had its own way of sounding alive even when it was still. The crunch of boots on gravel, the distant chirp of a nocturnal insect, the faint rustle of Joshua tree leaves. And then I heard it again. The rumble. But it wasn't just a rumble this time. There was something more. Beneath it, woven into the low frequencies, were whispers. I could barely make them out. Faint, distorted, like voices just out of reach. I replayed the recording, increasing the volume. The whispers grew clearer, but still impossible to understand. Words, maybe, but no language I recognized. My skin prickled. I paused the recording and scanned the desert around me. Nothing. Just the same quiet emptiness. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I told myself the whispers were interference, maybe static, some strange quirk of the equipment. I'd been stressed, and stress does things to your mind. But the idea of those voices followed me as I hiked through the rocky hills near my camp. The old gold rush mines in the area were long abandoned, but their presence was still felt. Deep holes cut into the earth, now sealed off with rusted metal gates. I found one such mine shaft on my hike, the entrance yawning like a black mouth against the pale rock. A metal grate covered the opening, keeping anyone from wandering in, but I stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness. The air around the mine shaft felt heavier, colder, as if the earth itself was holding something back. That rumble I'd heard the night before. It came from below. I was sure of it now. I thought about recording near the mine shaft just to see what I might pick up, but something in me hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the silence around me wasn't as empty as it seemed. That night, I set up the microphones again, this time pointing them toward the distant hills where the mine shaft lay hidden. I wanted to capture it, whatever it was. I sat in my chair, staring out at the stars, waiting for the desert to speak. It didn't take long. The hum returned, deep and slow, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I felt it in my bones, a low-frequency rumble that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I pressed the headphones to my ears, listening intently as the sound grew louder. And then came the whispers. This time, they were clearer. Not just whispers, voices. Actual voices, speaking in hushed tones, too far away to make out completely, but undeniably real. They ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of the rumble, like a conversation just out of reach. I sat up straighter, adrenaline coursing through me. I increased the volume, trying to isolate the sounds, but they remained indistinct. It was maddening. Right there, so close, but still beyond my grasp. And then, I heard my father. I froze, the headphones slipping from my hands. It was his voice, clear as day, calling my name. Kyle! I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, scanning the empty desert. But there was nothing. No one. Just the vast, dark expanse of the desert stretching out before me. I yanked the headphones back on, my hands shaking. Kyle. It was him. My father's voice, distant, layered with the whispers. I ripped the headphones off and stood, staring out at the night. My breath came in ragged gasps. I hadn't heard his voice since the hospital, since that last, terrible night. There was no way this was real. There was no way I could be hearing him now, here, miles from anyone. Unless I looked toward the distant hills, toward the mine shaft. The rumble beneath the ground seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. The whispers returned, louder now, more desperate, as if they were urging me to listen, to follow. I packed up my equipment, my hands fumbling with the wires, and threw it all into the RV. I had to know. I had to find out what was down there, what was calling to me. I reached the mine shaft just before dawn, the sky still dark, the air cold and biting. The metal grate over the entrance was rusted but intact. I peered into the darkness beyond, the cool air from the mine brushing against my skin like a whisper. The rumble was stronger here, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. And the voices, they were louder now, coming from deep within the earth. My father's voice was among them, clearer than before. Kyle, come down. I knew it wasn't him. I knew it in my rational mind, but the sound of his voice, calm, comforting, familiar, cut through me like a knife. I had to know. I had to find out what was down there. I pried the grate loose, my fingers trembling as I pulled it aside. The darkness of the mine shaft yawned before me, a deep, endless void. I hesitated for only a moment before lowering myself into the abyss. The rumble echoed around me, the walls of the mine vibrating with the force of it. The deeper I went, the more distorted reality became. The air grew thick, almost viscous, and the whispers twisted into strange, unintelligible sounds, wrapping around my mind like tendrils. And then there was silence. A silence so complete it was suffocating. The air felt still, dead. I stood in the blackness, my breath ragged, waiting for something, anything. That's when I heard it. A voice right behind me. Kyle. I spun around, my flashlight flickering in the dark. No one. Just the empty tunnel stretching out into the void. I turned back, the light from the entrance barely visible in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest. My father's voice was gone now, replaced by something else, something far older, far more dangerous. The rumble beneath the earth grew louder, almost deafening. And then I felt it. The ground shifted beneath my feet. Something was moving, something alive. I bolted for the surface, scrambling up the rusted ladder, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The whispers chased me, growing louder and more frantic as I climbed. I reached the top and flung myself out of the mine shaft, gasping for air as I shoved the grate back over the opening. the desert was still, quiet, but I could feel it. Beneath the earth, it was still there, waiting. I packed up and left Joshua Tree that morning. The desert didn't give me peace. It didn't give me the silence I wanted. It gave me something else. Even now, as I drive away, I can still hear it. That low, rhythmic rumble vibrating beneath the ground. The whispers, faint but ever present, just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes, when the road is quiet and the wind dies down, I hear my father's voice. "Kyle, come back." But I know better now. I'll never go back. Not to Joshua Tree. Not to the sound beneath. I've worked in national parks for 10 years. People think it's peaceful, the perfect life for someone who wants to escape the noise. But let me tell you, the wilderness can be relentless. Most of the time, it's the campers who drive you insane, ignoring every rule, thinking nature is their playground. The Chiricahua Mountains were supposed to be my break from that chaos. I thought I'd be alone. No tourists, no responsibilities, just me and the open sky. I was wrong. I had parked my RV near a formation of ancient rocks, close to where the locals said the Apache once held sacred ceremonies. A ranger I met during my years in the parks had told me about it. I remember him saying, "Don't light any fires near the stones. It messes with the old ways." I scoffed at the time. I wasn't one for superstition. Still, there was something eerie about the place as I set up camp. The rocks were oddly shaped, towering over the landscape like silent sentinels. The air around them felt different, heavy with a stillness I couldn't explain. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. There were no animals, no wind, just an oppressive silence that hung over the area. I chalked it up to being out in the wild. The second night, though, that's when things started to shift. I had decided to ignore the warning about lighting fires near the stones. It was getting cold, and the thought of a night without warmth didn't sit well with me. I gathered some wood, started a small fire, and settled down beside it with Max, my old border collie, by my side. As I stared into the flames, something caught my eye. The fire flickered unnaturally, as if the wind was blowing through it, except there was no wind. Max sat up, his ears alert, staring into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't see what he was growling at, but his hackles were raised. "Easy, boy," I muttered, trying to calm him. My own pulse had quickened, though. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching from the shadows. Max continued to growl, his eyes locked on the perimeter of the camp. It was then that I first noticed the shadows. They flickered at the edges of the light, just beyond the fire. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, tricks of the flames. But the longer I stared, the more I could make out their shapes, tall, human-like figures moving in the darkness. I stood up quickly, grabbing Max's collar. My eyes darted around the campsite, but there was nothing beyond the fire. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin. I extinguished the fire and climbed into the RV with Max, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. The silence outside felt suffocating. The next morning, I decided to explore the area more. The night's strange events lingered in my mind, but I tried to push them aside. The sunlight made it easier to dismiss my fears. I hiked deeper into the mountains, enjoying the isolation, the raw beauty of the landscape. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something strange, an old ceremonial site. At first, it looked like a simple stone circle, but as I walked closer, I saw the remnants of a fire pit, its rocks scorched black. The ground around the circle was covered in markings, worn with age but still visible, etched deep into the earth. It was as if some ancient ritual had been performed here long ago. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stood in the center of the circle. The air felt heavier here, as if the very ground beneath my feet held some dark secret. I snapped a few photos on my phone, documenting the strange markings, but a sense of unease nagged at me. The same feeling I'd had the night before, the sensation of being watched, was back. I returned to my RV that afternoon, unsettled by the day's discovery. That night, I couldn't resist lighting a fire again. I figured it was just nerves, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the flames danced higher, they flickered violently, rising unnaturally tall before suddenly extinguishing themselves in a burst of cold air. Max yelped, retreating into the RV. I sat there in the sudden darkness, staring at the now dead fire pit. The temperature around me had dropped sharply, and I felt wrong, like I was standing on cursed ground. Then, in the flicker of my dying flashlight, I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their bodies outlined in the faint glow of the fire's embers. They moved silently, slowly, as if gliding over the earth. They looked human, but not. Their forms were shrouded in darkness, but their movements were too precise, too deliberate. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut. I wasn't a superstitious man, but the cold fear that gripped me then was undeniable. The days that followed blurred together. The strange events escalated. Each night, the shadows returned. Sometimes they danced in the flames, their movements eerily graceful, like they were performing some ancient ritual. Other times, I saw them just standing there, watching me from the edges of the forest, their dark eyes gleaming in the night. I couldn't leave. I tried to pack up, but the trails seemed to loop back on themselves, no matter which direction I went. The mountains were trapping me, twisting the paths so I couldn't escape. I realized then that I had disturbed something ancient, something powerful. I had heard the stories about the fire dancers, Apache spirits who performed rituals to keep a dangerous entity, Nahasu, bound to the earth. They were supposed to protect the land, to keep the wandering flame from consuming everything in its path. But I had broken their sacred circle, and now the wandering flame was free. At night, the fire I lit no longer obeyed the laws of nature. It grew uncontrollably, consuming the wood in seconds, the flames rising higher and higher, forming strange, twisting shapes. And within the fire, I saw faces of men, twisted in pain, their bodies writhing as if they were trapped in the flames. Max refused to go near the fire anymore. He whined and scratched at the RV door every time I tried to go outside. I didn't blame him. The air around the campsite felt alive with heat, the flames whispering to me, calling me closer. On the fifth night, I heard the whispers. They weren't in English. They were ancient, foreign words carried on the wind, words I couldn't understand. But I knew what they wanted. The fire dancers were trying to finish their ritual, but they couldn't. They were trapped, doomed to repeat their ancient dance in an endless loop, never able to contain the wandering flame. The flames danced higher and higher, and then Nahasu appeared. It was a towering figure made entirely of fire and smoke, its eyes glowing with malevolent light, its body twisted and writhed, a living inferno. I could feel its heat even from inside the RV, a searing, unbearable heat that scorched the air. It was hunting me, searching for the soul that had freed it. I knew then that the only way to stop it was to finish the ritual. The fire dancers needed me. I grabbed the photos I had taken at the ceremonial site and ran toward the stone circle, Max following close behind. The forest around me was alive with flames, the trees burning without being consumed. Nahasu was coming for me, its fiery tendrils licking at my heels. When I reached the circle, the fire dancers were already there, their ghostly forms moving in a synchronized dance. But they were incomplete. Something was missing. I had to help them. I had to finish the dance. Using the photos as my guide, I mimicked their movements, stepping into the circle. The heat was unbearable, but I forced myself to continue, moving in time with the dancers. As I completed the final step, the ground beneath me rumbled, and the flames around us roared to life. Nahasu screamed, its fiery form twisting in agony as the ritual took hold. The flames imploded, sucking Nahasu back into the earth, dragging the wandering flame back to its prison. And then, just like that, it was over. The forest was still again, the fire gone, the dancers vanished. I stood alone in the circle, my body covered in sweat and soot, my heart pounding in my chest. Max nudged my leg, whimpering softly. I knelt down, running a hand through his fur. We were safe, for now. But as I packed up the RV the next morning, I knew one thing for sure. I would never return to the Chiricahua Mountains. The land was at peace again, but the fire dancers would always be watching, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to disturb their sacred ground. I wouldn't be that fool again. I told myself I was ready to come back. It had been almost 2 years since the last time I'd set foot in a forest, but I convinced myself this trip would be different. It wasn't like the others. This was supposed to be just work. An article for a travel magazine about the remote wilderness of Olympic National Park. It was the kind of thing I'd done 100 times before I quit my job as a park ranger. I used to be good at this. But as the RV rumbled deeper into the park, the dense, looming pines casting long shadows across the narrow road, I could feel the knot tightening in my stomach. The deeper I went, the heavier the air seemed to get, thick with moisture and silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of branches overhead. No birds, no wind, just the eerie quiet that made me want to turn around. I shook it off. This was just a job, after all. I found a campsite near a remote lake tucked away in the forest, far from the main trails. The kind of place most visitors wouldn't bother with. It was perfect for the article. Isolated, picturesque, and serene. As I stepped out of the RV, the air hit me like a wall. Thick, wet, and still. The trees rose high above, ancient and gnarled, their branches tangled like fingers reaching toward the sky. I set up my camera, took a few shots of the lake, and tried to focus. But the quiet, it clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I hadn't been out in the wilderness since the last search and rescue mission, the one that had gone so wrong, the one that left me with ghosts I couldn't shake. I'd hoped this trip would help me face them, push through the fear. But that was before I heard the voice. It started on the first night, just after dusk. I was sitting by the fire, reviewing the photos I'd taken that day, when I heard it. Faint, almost drowned out by the crackle of the fire. It was a voice, calling from somewhere in the distance. "Help! Me!" I froze, my fingers tightening around the camera. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. I stood up, my heart pounding. My instincts kicked in. After years as a ranger, I couldn't ignore a distress call, no matter how faint. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The forest was still, the trees standing like silent sentinels around me. "Hello?" I called, my voice too loud in the quiet. No answer, just the sound of the fire crackling and the faint rustling of leaves. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for the voice to come again. But the longer I listened, the more I doubted what I'd heard. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was nothing. I couldn't afford to get spooked on the first night. I forced myself to sit back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the thought gnawed at me for the rest of the night, lingering in the back of my mind like a splinter. The next day, I hiked deeper into the forest, hoping to capture more shots for the article. The trail was overgrown, the trees crowding in on either side, their moss-covered trunks casting long shadows across the path. It felt like the forest was alive, watching. I hadn't felt that in a long time. As I moved farther in, the sense of unease only grew. My GPS flickered, the signal cutting in and out, and the trail seemed to shift beneath my feet. I was experienced. Years of search and rescue missions had given me a sharp sense of direction. But out here, I felt like the forest was swallowing me. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. And then I heard it again. Help! Me! This time, the voice was closer, clearer. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. It sounded like a woman, her voice soft and pleading, echoing through the trees. Help! Please! My instincts warred with my rational mind. I knew I should turn back, but what if someone really was out there, lost and hurt? What if this was the one time I could actually make a difference, after all the failures that haunted me? Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the sound. The trail led me to a small clearing by the lake, the water dark and still beneath the thick canopy of trees. The voice had stopped, and the silence settled around me like a blanket, thick and suffocating. I scanned the shoreline, looking for any sign of movement, any sign of a person. But there was nothing. Just the still water and the ancient trees standing watch. A cold wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I frowned, stepping closer to the edge of the lake, my eyes searching the water for any sign of life. And then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a cry for help. This time, it was my name. Dan. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. It echoed through the trees, twisting around me, pulling at something deep inside. Dan, help me. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the lake, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd been on enough rescue missions to know when something wasn't right. But this was something else, something I couldn't explain. I turned and hurried back toward camp, my mind racing. The voice couldn't have known my name. There was no way. It had to be in my head. It had to be. That night, the voice came again, louder this time, closer. I was sitting inside the RV, the doors locked, trying to write up notes for the article, when I heard it. My name, whispered from just outside the door. Dan. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The voice was so close now, so real. It sounded like it was right outside. Dan, come help me. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding as I stepped toward the door. My rational mind screamed at me not to open it, but the pull was too strong. I needed to know. I needed to see. I yanked the door open, the cold night air rushing in. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees beyond the campsite. Nothing. Just the forest, silent and still. But the voice kept calling, closer now, insistent. Dan, help. I stepped outside, the light trembling in my hand as I scanned the tree line. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the forest, pulling me deeper into the woods. I knew I shouldn't follow it. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But the guilt, the weight of all those people I couldn't save, it was too much. I took a step toward the trees. The forest closed in around me as I moved toward the voice, the trees twisting and shifting in the dark. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if the darkness was swallowing the light. The voice grew louder, more desperate, and now it wasn't just calling my name, it was mimicking my own voice. Dan, help me. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks, the words overlapping, disorienting. My pulse quickened, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the lake, watching me. It was barely more than a shadow, its form twisted and indistinct, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The voice echoed again, but this time it didn't come from the figure. It came from behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was everywhere now, surrounding me, mocking me. Help. Help. Dan. The figure stepped closer, and I realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't just some shadow. It was me. The reflection, the echo. It wore my face, twisted and hollow, its eyes dark and empty. It opened its mouth, and my own voice came out, distorted and wrong. Help? Me? I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The forest twisted around me, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like claws. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, the voice following me, chasing me. I didn't stop running until I reached the RV. I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. The forest outside was silent now, the voice gone, but the weight of it still lingered, pressing down on me like a heavy fog. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed up and left Olympic National Park behind, the trees shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't let me go. And though the voice was silent now, I knew it was still out there, waiting for the next person to call for help, and waiting for someone like me to answer. I've always felt more comfortable in the wilderness than around people. Nature, for all its dangers, has a predictable rhythm, an order that people never seem to have. After years of guiding clueless tourists through parks and putting up with their complaints, I finally had enough. I quit. Sold everything that tethered me to the grind, bought an RV, and drove west. Olympic National Forest was the perfect place to disappear. Deep, dense, isolated. That's what I needed. No people, no noise, just the forest. My plan was simple. Scout out a remote campsite, test it for a few days, and see if this was where I could finally settle off the grid. I found a clearing near an overgrown trailhead miles away from any main road. I parked the RV and stepped out into the fresh air. The smell of pine and wet earth filled my lungs, grounding me. This was exactly what I needed. Just me and the forest. No distractions. But from the first night, I sensed something was off. The campfire crackled softly as I sat back, staring into the flames. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I knew these woods should have been alive with sounds. Owls hooting, small animals scurrying through the brush, insects buzzing. But there was nothing. Just the fire and the trees swaying gently in the wind. I wasn't spooked easily. As a former park ranger, I had dealt with more than my fair share of unsettling wilderness moments. But this felt different. Something about the stillness bothered me, like the forest itself was watching, waiting. And then came the first sound, a soft rustling in the underbrush. I snapped my head up, my eyes scanning the tree line. The fire's light didn't reach far, and beyond the glow, the forest was pitch black. The rustling came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct snap of a twig. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. No eyes reflecting the light, no movement, just trees and shadows. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, though the words didn't calm me. I'd been around enough wildlife to know what animals sounded like when they moved through the forest. This was different, deliberate, cautious. The rustling stopped and the silence returned, but the feeling didn't go away. That sensation of being watched, like unseen eyes were following my every move. I took a breath, forcing myself to relax. "It's nothing, Tom," I told myself. "Get some sleep." The next day, I set out to explore deeper into the woods, following the faint remnants of an old trail. The forest was thick with moss-covered trees and tangled undergrowth, the air damp and heavy. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Halfway through the hike, I noticed strange markings on the trees. At first, they seemed like scratches, maybe from a bear or cougar, but as I looked closer, I saw they were too deliberate. They weren't random marks. They formed patterns, symbols, crude but unmistakable. I frowned, running my hand over the rough bark. What could have made these? They didn't seem natural, but they were old, ancient even, worn down by time and weather. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about these symbols felt wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, stronger now. I turned, scanning the forest. The trees seemed closer, the shadows deeper. For the first time in years, I felt a twinge of unease in the woods. Pushing the thoughts aside, I continued hiking, but the day never felt right after that. I came across more strange things. An old, rusted camping knife half buried in the ground, a single leather boot covered in moss, its owner long gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed up these remnants of human life, leaving only traces behind. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already low in the sky. The uneasy feeling followed me, lingering like a shadow. That night, the forest came alive. It started with the rustling again, but louder, like something was circling my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV, scanning the tree line. The sound stopped whenever the light hit, but the second I turned away, it would start up again, closer each time. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back toward the fire, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trees. Then I saw it, a shape, just for a second, moving between the trunks, too large to be an animal, too quick to be a person. The light flickered, and the shape disappeared. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice steady despite the rising panic. "Show yourself." Silence. I stood there, breathless, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest felt alive, aware of me in a way I couldn't explain. I knew I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching. I retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. The sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing outside the vehicle. The next day, I drove into a nearby town for supplies. It was a tiny place, more of a cluster of old buildings than a real town. At the general store, I met Roy, an old-timer who had lived in the area his whole life. He had the look of someone who'd seen things, his weathered face lined with stories he didn't want to tell. "You're camping deep in the forest, eh?" he said as I loaded my supplies onto the counter. "Not many folks go out that far." "I like the quiet," I replied. Roy grunted, his eyes narrowing. "You ever hear about the Watcher?" I gave him a sideways glance. "The what?" "Local legend," Roy said, lowering his voice. "Some folks say there's an old spirit out there in the woods. The Watcher. Been there longer than any of us. It doesn't bother you if you don't bother it, but..." He trailed off, his expression darkening. "You go too deep, and it'll start watching you. And if it decides you don't belong there..." He left the rest unsaid, but I got the message. I laughed it off, shaking my head. "I've heard plenty of ghost stories in my time, Roy. This one's no different." But even as I drove back to camp, his words gnawed at me. The Watcher. Could it explain the strange sounds, the feeling of being watched? I didn't believe in spirits or ancient forest guardians. I believed in what I could see, what I could touch. But something about this forest was different. That night, the forest made its move. I stepped outside to check the fire, and that's when I saw them. Totems. They were small, crude structures made of sticks and bones, arranged in a circle around my RV. I hadn't put them there. My pulse quickened as I examined one of the totems, its twisted form unsettling in the flickering firelight. Who could have done this? No one else was out here. At least, no one I could see. Then, from the trees, came the breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic. I stood frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. The breath was low, primal, like the forest itself was exhaling. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a large deer. But, as it moved closer, I saw the truth. The figure was tall, gaunt, its body shifting like smoke. It had no face, just glowing eyes, eyes that stared straight into me, cold and unblinking. The Watcher. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as if the forest itself was holding me in place. The Watcher stood there, silent, watching me with those glowing eyes, its form flickering at the edges like it wasn't fully part of this world. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. The Watcher tilted its head as if considering me, and then, without a sound, it vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, waiting for the Watcher to return. But it never did. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up the RV as quickly as I could, ready to put the forest behind me. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. My phone, fully charged the day before, was now drained as well. The forest wasn't letting me go. That night, the Watcher came again. It circled the RV, its shape flickering in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an ancient light. The trees seemed to bend toward it, like they were part of it, like the whole forest was the Watcher. I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and stepped outside, heart pounding in my chest. The Watcher was waiting, its eyes locked on mine. "You don't belong here," a voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't the Watcher speaking. It was the forest itself. I backed away, stumbling through the trees, the Watcher's eyes following me. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing. The forest felt alive, the trees closing in around me, the air thick with the Watcher's presence. By dawn, I finally got the RV started and drove away without looking back. But as I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher was still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next person to venture too deep. The Watcher let me go, but not without a warning. I've been alone in the wilderness plenty of times. It's where I belong, away from people, noise, and the chaos of the world. But something about Olympic National Forest felt different. Not different in the way a place can feel unfamiliar, but different in a way that gets under your skin and won't let go. I parked my RV in a small clearing, the trees towering over me like silent giants. This part of the forest was off the beaten path, miles away from any tourist trail. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, pure and uninterrupted. I had come here to find peace, to scout for a spot where I could live off-grid permanently. After years of dealing with tourists and park regulations as a ranger, I was done with people. The forest had always been my refuge, my sanctuary. This time, I wanted it to be my home. The first night was calm. The only sounds were the crackling of the campfire and the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of peaceful silence I craved. No phones, no traffic, just me and the forest. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, I heard something. It was subtle at first, like the snap of a twig, then another, and another. I knew the sounds of the forest. I'd spent years living in it, studying it. This wasn't an animal. Animals were chaotic in their movements, unpredictable. This was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like footsteps. I shone my flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. Nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and motionless. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I hadn't slept well in days. I was probably just tired. But even as I climbed into my RV for the night, the unease lingered. The next day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. I wanted to get a better sense of the land, see if there were any good spots to set up a permanent camp. The trail was overgrown, the forest dense with moss-covered trees and ferns that seemed to close in around me. As I walked, I started noticing strange things, markings on the trees. They weren't scratches from animals. They were too precise, too deliberate. Symbols, almost like someone had carved them with a purpose. The deeper I went, the more unsettling things became. I found objects, old, rusted tools, a torn boot, and what looked like the remains of an old campsite. It had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. I bent down, picking up a rusted camping knife, its blade dull and chipped. Who left this behind? And why? Something wasn't right. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, a growing sense that I was being watched. Every instinct I had, honed from years in the wilderness, screamed at me to leave. But I didn't. I was too stubborn, too determined. As I made my way back to the RV, that feeling of being watched followed me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see someone standing there, hidden among the trees. But there was no one, just the forest, looming and oppressive. That night, things escalated. I sat by the fire again, trying to shake off the unease that had been gnawing at me all day. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches overhead, making the trees sway like shadowy figures in the darkness. As I watched the flames flicker, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, standing up, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the perimeter of the camp, shining the light into the trees. "Who's out there?" I called out, my voice steady, but my grip on the flashlight tight. No answer, but the footsteps stopped. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting. Nothing moved. The forest had fallen silent again, as if holding its breath. I lowered the flashlight, my pulse racing. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe it was the wind or some animal I hadn't seen. I was about to turn back to the fire when I noticed something on the ground. A small totem made of sticks and bones placed right at the edge of my camp. It hadn't been there before. I knelt down, examining it. It was crude, hastily put together, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Someone, or something, had been here, watching, waiting, and they weren't happy I was here. The next day, I decided to get some answers. I drove into the nearest town, a small, run-down place with a general store that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Inside, the shelves were lined with canned goods, old tools, and faded postcards of Olympic National Park. The man behind the counter was old, his skin weathered from years of sun and wind. His name tag read Roy, and he looked at me with tired eyes as I approached. "You out, camping in the forest?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah," I replied. "Deeper in, though. I found some strange things, markings on the trees, weird totems." Roy didn't react at first. He just stared at me, as if weighing whether to tell me something or not. "You're in Watcher territory," he said finally, his voice low. "Locals don't go that deep anymore, not since people started going missing. I frowned. The Watcher? He nodded. Old legend, spirit of the forest, they say. It watches over the land, keeps the balance, punishes those who don't respect it. You're not the first one to camp out there, but I don't know anyone who's come back the same. I didn't believe in legends. I believed in what I could see, what I could prove. But something about the way Roy said it sent a chill through me. I thanked him, bought a few supplies, and left, my mind spinning. When I got back to camp, things were worse. The totems were gone, but my gear had been moved. Not stolen, just moved, slightly out of place, like someone had gone through my things but didn't take anything. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. As I sat by the fire that night, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The footsteps were back, circling closer, faster. The trees seemed to shift and move in the darkness, closing in on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and hunting knife, storming into the woods. "Show yourself!" I shouted into the trees, my voice echoing through the forest. "I know you're out there." The footsteps stopped. The forest fell silent. And then I saw it. Standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the flickering light of the fire, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. Something old. Something primal. The Watcher. It stared at me, its body shifting like smoke, its glowing eyes unblinking. I felt rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest, fear paralyzing me. It wasn't attacking, but its presence was suffocating, as if it was judging me, weighing whether I had crossed some line. I raised the knife, my hand trembling, and took a step forward. "What do you want?" The Watcher tilted its head, its eyes never leaving mine. Then, without a sound, it turned and vanished into the trees, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the air with indistinct voices that I couldn't understand. The sense of being watched never left, even inside the RV. I felt it in every corner of the clearing, in every shadow that flickered beyond the firelight. By morning, I had made up my mind. I had to leave. Whatever was out here, it wasn't something I could fight or understand. I packed up my gear, threw it into the RV, and turned the key. The engine wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I hadn't left anything running. There was no reason for it to be dead. Panic clawed at me, but I forced it down. I checked my phone. The battery, too, was drained. I was trapped. That night, the Watcher came back. I saw it again, standing at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was undeniable. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees shifting like living things, pressing closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. My legs felt weak, my body trembling with fear, but I couldn't stay in the RV, not anymore. The Watcher's eyes followed me as I moved closer, my heart hammering in my chest. It didn't attack, it didn't move, it just watched, its gaze penetrating, ancient, and full of a silent, terrible understanding. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A voice, not spoken aloud, but inside my mind. "You don't belong here." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stumbled back, the flashlight flickering as I dropped it to the ground. In that moment, I understood. The Watcher wasn't just a spirit or a legend. It was a guardian, an ancient force that protected the forest from those who didn't understand it, who tried to claim it for themselves. I had crossed a line. At dawn, the RV started without a problem. I didn't question it. I didn't care. I left the forest behind, the trees shrinking in the rearview mirror as I drove away. But even as I put miles between myself and Olympic National Forest, I knew I'd never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, watching, waiting, The Watcher had let me go, for now, but the forest was its domain, and I was just an intruder. And in the back of my mind I knew I would never be truly alone again. The Watcher would always be there, waiting, watching from the shadows. When I first arrived in Desolation Canyon, it was everything I hoped for: remote, untouched, and vast. The sandstone cliffs stretched on for miles, jagged and towering, and the heat of the sun baked the rocky terrain beneath my feet. It was beautiful in its isolation, the kind of place that made you feel small, insignificant. I was here to prove something, mostly to myself. After what happened on my last trip, almost falling to my death while climbing Mount Hood, my confidence had taken a hit. My followers expected more from me. I was the guy who went to the edge, the one who pushed himself to the brink and came back with stories of survival. That's why I chose Desolation Canyon. Its reputation for being eerily quiet, for pushing people's limits of isolation, was exactly what I needed. And honestly, I wasn't afraid of a little silence. The first day went smoothly. I parked the RV in a small clearing near the canyon rim, setting up camp and scouting the area for good shots. I spent hours filming the dramatic landscape, capturing the way the light shifted over the sandstone cliffs, casting long, eerie shadows. The air was dry and still, with not a single cloud in the sky. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted but satisfied. My footage was good, really good, and I knew my followers would eat it up. I settled into the RV that night, editing some of the shots while outside the desert cooled rapidly, the heat draining away into the dark. And that's when it hit me. The silence. It wasn't like any quiet I'd experienced before. Out here in the canyon, the usual nighttime sounds were absent. No wind rustling through the trees, no insects buzzing, no distant calls of nocturnal animals. Just nothing. It was as if the entire world had been muted, and all that was left was this crushing, overwhelming stillness. At first, I welcomed it. After all, I came here to escape the noise of the city, of my own thoughts, but the more I sat in it, the more oppressive it became. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, unnatural, like it was alive, pressing down on me from all sides. I lay in my bunk, staring up at the ceiling, trying to sleep, but it was impossible. My mind raced, searching for sounds that weren't there. I could almost hear something, like a faint hum in the distance, but when I strained to listen, it vanished, swallowed by the void. The next morning, I shook off the unease from the night before. It was just the isolation getting to me, I told myself. Being out here alone could mess with your head, but I was tough. I'd been through worse. So I packed my gear and set off into the canyon, determined to get more footage and push deeper into the wilderness. The landscape was stunning in its bleakness. Towering cliffs loomed overhead, the sun casting harsh shadows across the red rock. As I hiked, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My footsteps, normally so loud and crunching on the rocky terrain, sounded muted, like the earth was swallowing the sound before it even reached my ears. By midday, my compass started acting up. The needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on any direction. I tried using my phone's GPS, but there was no signal out here. That didn't bother me. I'd dealt with worse equipment failures before. Still, there was this growing feeling, this nagging thought in the back of my mind that I was losing my bearings. I turned back toward camp, following the route I thought I'd come from, but everything looked the same. The cliffs, the rocks, they blurred together, an endless repetition of barren landscape. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, but that wasn't possible. I never got lost. I always knew where I was. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the canyon, I finally made it back to the RV. The relief that washed over me was brief. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence hit again. Heavier this time, more insistent. That night, the hum returned. Louder, more distinct. The following days blurred together. Each night, the silence grew deeper, more suffocating. During the day, I'd venture out into the canyon. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the eerie quiet. Even my own voice, when I tried talking into the camera, felt wrong. Muted, as if the sound wasn't reaching the air. By the third night, I started hearing whispers. At first, they were faint, like wind blowing through a distant cave. But there was no wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Voices, multiple, low and droning, like a conversation happening just beyond my perception. I tried telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after days of isolation. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, growing louder, closer, until it felt like they were right outside the RV. I even stepped outside one night, shining my flashlight across the canyon's edge, but there was no one there. Just the void, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I was losing it. The thought chilled me to the bone. The nights after that were worse. The silence became a living thing, a presence that pressed against my skull, suffocating me in the absence of sound. The whispers grew more insistent, more frantic, like they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. I felt like I was being watched, like something was out there in the canyon, hiding just out of sight. During the day, the whispers faded, but the silence remained, and with it, a crushing sense of isolation. My equipment started malfunctioning, audio cutting out, footage corrupted with strange distortions. In one shot, I caught something, a shadow, flickering at the edge of the frame, there 1 second and gone the next. I replayed it over and over, convinced I had imagined it, but the shadow was real. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I had been to some of the most dangerous, isolated places in the world, but nothing compared to this. Nothing had ever made me feel so vulnerable. The fifth night was the breaking point. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the whispers came again. This time, they were clearer, closer. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The voices were calling my name. "Derek! Come to us." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I wasn't imagining it. The voices were real. They were calling me, beckoning me out into the canyon. I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight and throwing open the door. The night was pitch black, but I could still feel it. The weight of the silence pressing down on me, like the whole world had been swallowed by the void. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the canyon. Nothing. But the whispers were there, just beyond the light. "Come to us." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Away from the whispers, away from the silence. My footsteps barely made a sound as I sprinted through the rocky terrain, the cliffs towering around me, twisting and distorting in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the far end of the canyon, where the cliffs rose high and jagged, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like grasping fingers. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, but the whispers followed, swirling around me. That's when I saw it, a dark, looming rock formation at the base of the canyon. unlike anything I'd seen before. It was massive, towering above me, and as I stared at it, I realized the whispers were coming from inside. I felt the silence tighten, crushing me from all sides, and I knew then that it wasn't just the canyon. There was something here, something ancient and powerful, something that fed on the silence. It had been waiting for me, watching me, luring me deeper into the void. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as I stumbled back toward the RV. My body was trembling, my mind unraveling, but I had to get away. I had to leave before it was too late. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, only that I did. I slammed the door shut behind me, collapsing onto the floor, my entire body shaking. The whispers had stopped, but the silence remained, deeper than ever. As I sat there, staring out into the darkness, I knew one thing for certain. Desolation Canyon wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, and the silence was its voice, and now it had found me. When I finally left the canyon the next morning, the silence stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind. Even as the RV rumbled over the rocky terrain, even as the sounds of civilization returned, the void remained. I'll never go back. I can't. Because the silence, it's waiting.